Okay, so I decided to take a stab at making a smoked version of biryani, specifically smoked lamb biryani. Yeah, I know biryani and barbecue don't usually mix, but I thought it'd be really interesting to experiment with some American barbecue techniques on a classic Indian dish. I wanted to see if I could bring that deep smoky flavor onto the layers of spices and rice you'd expect from biryani. It's definitely not traditional, but I'm excited to show you how it turned out and, well, what I learned along the way. If you haven't had biryani before, it's basically this amazing rice dish loaded with spices, meat, sometimes vegetables, and all kinds of deep flavors. It's a staple in Indian cooking, and there are about a million ways to make it, depending on where you're from or who your grandma is. So I thought I'd throw in my own spin with some American barbecue techniques, because why not? The most common way to make biryani is to slow cook the meat in a spice gravy and then layer it up with some rice, fresh herbs, and fried onions before letting it steam to finish. Some recipes try to bring a touch of smokiness by adding a piece of hot charcoal, but honestly, I feel that's just not going to match the deep and smoky flavor you get from American style barbecue. For this experiment, I wanted to pack in as much smoky flavor as I could, so I smoked the meat and the gravy separately. That way, there was more surface area exposed to absorb all that smoke. The first thing I did was I got started with setting up the grill for smoking. I'm using my kettle again with the slow and sear for a low and slow setup. I was trying to hold the temperature at about 250 degrees for 3 hours, so I filled the low and slow up a third of its way with charcoal and then just lit a few to get it going. For an extra smoke flavor, I also tossed in a few extra chunks of applewood. While the grill was coming up to temp, I went ahead and started prepping the meat. I've got a 5-pound piece of lamb shoulder here. About half of it's going to biryani, and the other half I'm going to enjoy just by its own as spiced lamb. For this experiment, I used boneless lamb, but if I'm honest, if I were to do this again, I'd go with bone-in cuts like lamb chops, since the bone actually adds a lot of flavor to this dish. I cut these into pretty large chunks, about 1.5 inches thick, so they can smoke for a couple hours without overcooking. For the spices, I went with the standard Indian marinade. For each pound of meat, I used a teaspoon of Kashmiri powder, a teaspoon of garam masala, a quarter teaspoon of turmeric, a teaspoon of minced ginger, a teaspoon of minced garlic, and about half a teaspoon of salt. I mixed it together with the lamb and made sure that every piece was well coated. Okay, now check in the grill. It's at the temperature that I need, so on went the meat. I plan to use about 2.5 cups of dry basmati rice for this biryani. Yeah, for that amount of rice, this is a lot of meat, but I figured I'd make a little extra to have on its own. Okay, so the spacing is a bit of a puzzle here. If I were just smoking the lamb, no problem. But I also wanted to smoke the gravy to get that extra smoky flavor, so I gotta leave room for a 12-inch pan on here somewhere. This is a little tricky since I only have a 22-inch grill. Alright, now to the gravy. The traditional way to make this gravy is to start by sauteing some onions and then add the marinated meat and yogurt. But since I'm smoking it, I'm skipping all of that and just throwing everything straight into a cast iron pan that'll heat up on the smoker. So I coated the bottom of the pan with a little oil and tossed in about 2 cups of fried onions. For the spices, you could just use garam masala, but I used a pre-mixed biryani spice packet. This one is for Bombay style biryani. There are a ton of different biryani flavors, so use whichever you want, or just use garam masala if that's all you have. I picked this up at a local Asian market, but you can find it on Amazon too if you don't have one nearby. Next, I stirred in about a cup of Greek yogurt and a cup of water. Normally, you wouldn't actually bother with the extra water since the liquid from the onions and the meat would do the trick. But since I'm smoking it, I know that most of the moisture is going to evaporate, so I just put extra. And then I went heavy on the herbs, cilantro and mint. I know, for some people, cilantro tastes like slow, but not for me. If that's you, just stick to the mint. I'm going to use way more herbs than most recipes will call for because, well, I just like it that way. Now, on went the gravy. Like I said before, getting this to fit was a bit of a puzzle. I tried to use a grill rack, but nope, the lid wouldn't close. So I had to get clever. Bricks, why not, right? I had some fire bricks handy, so I put one on the grate and then perched the pan right on top of it. This keeps the base off the heat so I don't end up scorching the damn thing. While everything was smoking away, I got going on the rice. I'm using about 2.5 cups of dried basmati rice here. Honestly, if you got a rice cooker, use it. Rice cookers make the best biryani rice, hands down. I got this one from Zojirushi, and for me, it's awesome. Perfect rice every single damn time. I've got the smallest model though, so I had to do this in 2 batches. For each batch, I tossed in a piece of cinnamon stick, a few black peppercorns, a sprinkle of cumin seeds, and don't forget a pinch of salt and a little bit of oil too. Seasoning makes all the difference. Alright, it's been about 3 hours, so let's see what we got. First up, the gravy. Oh, now look at that. That's interesting. It's got a nice smoky layer on top, exactly what I was hoping for. Gonna give this a good stir and mix the smokiness all throughout the gravy. I don't want all of that flavor just hanging on the surface. I'm also gonna toast this back later to get some extra caramelization flavor going on. Okay, now onto the lamb. Let's check the temp. Most of the pieces are hitting between 130 to 140 degrees, which is right where I want them. I was gonna give them a quick sear to get some nice char marks, then let them finish cooking together with the rice. Like I said earlier, I'm keeping some of this lamb just to have as is. It's going to be about medium once it has a chance to rest. Nice and pink in the middle, juicy and tender. Exactly what you want with lamb, because rare or medium rare lamb can have way too much unrendered fat, which for me is no fun. Alright, this step's optional, but I'm going to go for a quick char just to get a boost of flavor. I flipped the charcoal basket upside down to create a bit of a heat vortex, funneling the heat straight up so I can grill the lamb right over it. It's a simple way to get a large amount of direct heat for a nice sear. I gave them a few minutes on each side. This already has enough smoke from before, so I just wanted a bit of char. Okay, now this step's optional too, but I wanted to cook down the gravy a bit more. I put a cast iron pan on the heat with some oil, then sauteed about half an additional cup of fried onions, and then poured in the smoked gravy along with a little bit of water. Let this all cook down for a bit, just to let those flavors deepen. Alright, it's time to put everything together. First, I laid down a thin layer of rice on the pan, just enough to cover the bottom. Then I spooned on a layer of smoked biryani gravy. I know I made a little more than I probably need, but this is all part of the experiment, right? I can always save the extra for another batch of biryani. Next up, I layered on some of the smoked meat and tossed in a handful of herbs, and then covered that up with some more rice. To top it off, I threw on a few pieces of more smoked meat, sprinkled on some fried onions, and added a hit of herbs. Finally, a drizzle of saffron-soaked milk went on the top for that classic yellow color and flavor. Alright, now time to finish this off. I'm going to steam everything together by covering the pan with some tin foil before popping the lid back on. The idea here is to trap in as much steam as I can so everything steams and those flavors all meld together. Now if I were to do this the traditional way, I'd use a thick kitchen towel under the lid or even seal the gap with a dough mixture to lock in the steam. But you know what? Tinfoil is a lot easier and it'll do the trick just fine for this. Alright, back on the grill it goes. But I'm not just going to plop this straight on the grates. That'll be a recipe for burning everything at the bottom. Instead, what I'm going to use is a pizza stone underneath to work as a heat deflector. If you don't have a pizza stone, no big deal. You can just set it up for an indirect cook and you're good to go. I'm going to let this go for about another hour at about 300 degrees, give or take, just to let everything come together. Alright, the moment of truth. Let's dig in. All those flavors had plenty of time to mingle, and I gotta say, the rice came out perfectly fluffy. That's all thanks to the rice cooker. It's pretty much the secret weapon for making perfect biryani rice. The flavor of the gravy was spot on. It's got that authentic biryani flavor, but it also kind of tastes like barbecue. It's super smoky and I think it's awesome. It's a different flavor that you don't usually associate it with biryani, but it totally works. And the meat? Super tender, juicy, and packed with flavor. In terms of the texture, it's more like a perfectly cooked steak than braised meat. If I'm being picky, one thing I do differently next time is to smoke the lamb for a longer time. Or even smoke it in the gravy. That way, it would get more of that braised texture like a pot roast instead of a steak-like bite. Oh, and I'd also chop up the herbs a little finer, but I'm only saying that because my wife made me promise I'd mention it. Alright, catch you later.